Welcome back this evening for our fourth, I can't remember. Anyway, we've done a whole bunch of lectures on art in Florence this summer, and this is our concluding lecture on the Florentine Renaissance. And then we're off to Rome for a couple lectures, which I'll tell you about at the end of this evening. A couple housekeeping things. We record all of our lectures and post them on our website. Caleb edits them and gets them up just a few days, generally after the lecture happens. So they're all there on our website. They're under. We have a media tab button, and they're on their lecture series on films. Everything's there. Please let me know what you think. Someone complimented us on the sound recording or the sound quality. And I was like, oh, thank you. Oh, I worked so hard at that. And the quality of the editing. So yes, thank you, Caleb, for doing that. We're working on trying to our idea with this, or our campaign with this, is just to try and make art history as accessible to as many people as possible. And so that's why we record all of our lectures, and we do post them online for free. And as always, we do, however, gratefully accept donations that goes into the research and the production of this lecture series. And we have our little bucket at the back. And as always, if you only have credit cards, we will happily take donation by credit card. We can make that happen. There's also a donation button on our website. That's it for now. Yes, so I think those are all my announcements. Yes, okay, carry on. So yes, welcome back to Florence. I've put up this slide a number of times over the course of the summer and during our lectures. And what we'll be talking about tonight is probably the arguably perhaps the most famous, well, you know what, we'll say the most famous sculpture from the Renaissance. The Mona Lisa might overtake the David for infamy, or maybe recognizability. But we'll say one of the most recognized works of the Italian Renaissance. And like I said, we're back in Florence, and we're talking about tonight, for the start of our evening, about a commission that was an idea they had for adorning the Duomo, so adorning the main cathedral here in Florence. And we've talked about that in a number of lectures. You can dig through our archives. We're building an archive now. It's really great. There's a little button. You can sort by period and by artist. Like, oh, there's only ever one by whatever artist it is, but I just keep adding. I'm like, oh, let's add more categories. It looks like there's a whole compendium there. Someday there will be. Yes, so we're talking about once again the construction of the Duomo. At the beginning of the Renaissance, the great cathedral in Florence had remained unfinished, of course, and we've talked about this before, where they had constructed the nave earlier, but the great dome hadn't yet been completed, and it was executed and conceived of brilliantly by the architect Brunelleschi, which we've talked about. So this was another project that was commissioned to adorn the buttresses of the great Duomo. So the buttresses here, so the buttresses holding up the dome itself, and the woolen guild. So this is the merchants, kind of the union of the cloth merchants, or the wool merchants in Florence. The guilds wielded great power in Florence, and we talked about this in another lecture as well, that Florence was a republic, so it wasn't ruled by a duke like it was, like Milan was ruled by the duke, and it wasn't ruled by the Pope as Rome. The papal states in Rome were ruled. Florence was a republic, and so that meant that the citizens felt a great sense of ownership or legitimacy or authority within the construction of the state. And a lot of power was wielded by these, they really are, they're in effect unions, or kind of powerful and wealthy groups of merchants divided up by whatever it was they were selling, right? So there was a silk merchants guild and a goldsmiths guild, and in this case, the wool guild wielded great power and authority. And they would set forth generally. There would be competitions or artistic commissions that they would put forward to the Florentine public for great art projects, and that fulfilled two purposes. So one, it emblemized, or it kind of signified the wealth and power of that particular guild. So the cloth guild could say to the goldsmith guild, my statue of David is bigger than your statue of David, therefore we have more money or more authority or whatever. We could commission a better artist. And also also a piece of propaganda, so they could, that this work of art was paid for by the wool merchants guild. And it was also something redemptive. Also, we've talked about this when we discussed the Medici family, that if there were any banking families did this a lot, where they would commission a great work of art and then donate it to a religious site. So they would donate it to the Duomo or donate it to a monastery in Florence as a way to compensate for charging people interest, right? Because if you charge interest, you're going to hell, according to the Catholic faith. So it was a way to, kind of compensate for that misdeed. It didn't hold them back from earning interest, and the Pope certainly knew how to kind of press those buttons and wield the guilt, the good Catholic guilt. You could fix up that monastery for us, Lorenzo de' Medici. And where was I going with this? Yes. So the wool merchants guild commissioned 12 statues that were supposed to adorn the buttresses of the great cathedral. They're not there to kind of disappoint you, so they don't exist. Donatello did one of Joshua made out of terracotta. It disappeared at some point in the 18th century. It's just gone. Michelangelo's, I'm spoiling it for you. So Michelangelo was supposed to put his David there. It didn't go there, right? So I'll tell you why it's not there. But there was a statue of Joshua that was supposed to go on one of the buttresses that was commissioned by Donatello. And then they also wanted a depiction of the figure of David. And they commissioned one artist to start the project. Oh, here's a better image of the buttresses. So it's kind of up in this area around the dome. They commissioned an artist. This is in the mid 1400s. Commissioned an artist named Deduccio to create a marble statue of David. And they sourced this marble from a town called Carrara. You've probably heard of it, Carrara marble. So it's this very famous white or kind of like bluish gray marble, some of the most prized marble in the world. And so the most beautiful marble sculptures you can think of are typically made out of Carrara marble. Very expensive, enormously expensive, really, really difficult to get back to Florence. This is where Carrara is. So here's Florence over here. Carrara is in the northwest. I mean, it's a sizable distance now. I mean, this is a chunk of Italy that they have to span to get a piece of marble, like a multi-ton, 10-ton, 10, 12-ton piece of marble from Carrara down to Florence. But they have this grand vision. They want a statue of David. David always held the idea of the story of David, which I'm sure most of you are familiar, but I'll recap it really quickly. There's David, there's a bad guy, Goliath. Goliath is really big, he's a giant. God favors David. David doesn't armor himself and he goes into battle against Goliath. And he has a sling, and he flings the sling, or flings the rock, I guess. Doesn't fling whatever. The rock comes out of the sling, hits Goliath in the head. Goliath dies. The end. So it's a great triumph of the underdog, because Goliath is the greatest warrior of the opposing side, and he's, like I said, he's a giant, kind of a giant among men, and his great armor, and has this enormous sword, and the story is then that David goes and takes the sword of Goliath and chops the head off Goliath, and he's always kind of shown. I'll show you some depictions of David, other ones, where he's kind of this like really sprightly, kind of pleased with himself, young man with like perched over Goliath's head. Anyway, so that's the story. And Florence identified always with the idea, or the mythology around this young David. So the young David being the underdog going up against the great warrior Goliath. Because Florence, as I mentioned, was this very small, but very, very powerful, very wealthy city-state, but it was always being attacked from, their arch enemy, Milan, from the north, and also from Siena, down here. Siena would always lose. Siena won one battle, and they still talk about it. Like 800 years ago. Florence won all of the battles, but Siena's like, remember that one time, though? And Rome was always seeking to take over Florentine territory, as was the Kingdom of Naples. I'm pointing down off the map. You know, it sounds south, right, guys? You're with me. So Italy was divided into a number of city-states. Italy wasn't unified as a country until the late 1800s. So they were always kind of vying for territory and bumping up against each other, and the French would invade and cause all kinds of trouble. We talked about that last time too with Savonarola. And so the Florentines were always, they retained their independence, they retained their republican status against kind of all of these foes. And there were a few times where they got really, really lucky. So there was one time when the Milanese army, the Duke of Milan, was invading, and a plague swept through, killed a whole bunch of Florentines, but it killed the Duke and wiped out a bunch of the Milanese army. And the Florentines were like, yes, God favors us. Even though anyway, so they claimed a great victory over Milan. It was kind of this idea that God favored them. God favored this small but mighty city-state. So they always had this deep, deep connection with David. And they didn't want no terracotta for David. Joshua can have that. But David has to be out of marble, the best marble they can find. So they go to Carrara. And here are the mines here. They're still in operation. So you can go visit the mines in Carrara. And they excavate this enormous hunk of stone, and they bring it back to the workshop of the Opera del Duomo, so the workspace for the Duomo here. And they commission an artist, like I said, Deduccio. And he works away at it for a number of years. He forms kind of the feet and the legs, we think. He might have drilled a hole through between the legs. He might have gone that far, maybe a bit of the drapery. But then for some unknown reason, he stops in 1464 with the death of Donatello. So whether Donatello we think was heavily involved with the project, or maybe in kind of a supervisory kind of capacity. So something happened that Deduccio stopped working on the sculpture of David. Some years pass, and then another artist named Rossellini takes over. He works on it for a little while. He stops. And then, quite sadly, it just sits open to the elements. This hunk of stone, this enormous hunk of enormously expensive marble in the workshop, which is kind of out back, like in behind the Duomo here. And in 1500, there was an inventory done of the opera, or of the workshop, the opera of the Duomo. And among the inventory is listed a certain figure of marble called David. Badly blocked out. You did a bad job, Deduccio, and supine, so laying down. And the overseers of the Duomo project decide to stand the sculpture up on its feet, and hopefully some artist would come along who would see it and could envision this final project, this final portrait of David, and take on the task. And the story is that no one wanted it. This was a bad job, okay? Like I mean, you don't want someone's half-started project, right? Nobody wants that, right? And so there's this badly blocked out. So two artists who have botched it up already, and And reportedly, there were some fissures, there were some cracks in the marble, so it was a bad piece of marble. You know, if you follow the sculpture St. John, a big part of the sculpture St. John project is that the artists are going around, they go to the quarries and they look for the perfect piece of marble, right, or the perfect piece of quartz, or something to construct the best piece of work they can do for the sculpture St. John. So the same thing, they're looking for flaws in the stone or flaws in the marble, right? So reportedly, there were some serious flaws. No one wanted to touch it. Not even, they pitched it to Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo says, nope, not having it. So Leonardo turned down this project. But along comes the 26-year-old Michelangelo, 26, and he manages to convince the overseers of the Duomo project to execute this depiction of David, and he's awarded the contract in 1501. So immediately after he pitches, I can do it, they give it to him, and 3 years later he unveils his version of the David. So I'll talk to you a bit about Michelangelo and where he comes from and how he has the audacity to think that he could create a 17 foot high depiction of David. So this is what we believe Michelangelo to look like. This is a portrait done by Daniele da Volterra, who is a follower of Michelangelo. He's always depicted, he's always kind of has this dark beard and kind of a mashed up nose. And he's always looking very irascible or kind of frowny. He has this reputation of being a rather grumpy sort. So I talked in a previous lecture of that fiery relationship between him and Pope Julius II, where Michelangelo would actually stand up to the Pope. I mean, this is the divinely ordained Pope, like the mouthpiece of God, and the Pope would say, Michelangelo, come down and finish my tomb or finish the Sistine Chapel, please. And Michelangelo would be, nope, I don't feel like it. I'm going back to Florence, or nope, I don't feel like it. I'm going back wherever. And he had a reputation of he would throw things at his assistants. He would chase them down and kind of pick fights with them. And anyway, he just kind of has this aura of this kind of hard to get along with, grumpy, moody kind of person. He's always depicted, anytime he pops up in paintings, kind of like this. There's one, we think it's a portrait of him in Raphael's School of Athens, and everybody else is very like standing around having a good time, and all the philosophers and Raphael is in there talking to everyone, and we think it's a depiction of Michelangelo down in the corner, kind of brooding and kind of turned away and not talking to anyone. Yes, and that I think from that portrait. Michelangelo looms so large in our collective consciousness, and the idea of the artist needing to be someone who is apart from society or it doesn't have the social skills or the social wherewithal to function in a normal society or is somehow detached. I think that emanates from Michelangelo, because it really wasn't the case. It wasn't the case with Leonardo da Vinci. Everyone loved Leonardo da Vinci. The king of France basically just paid Leonardo to hang out with him and have a chat whenever the king felt like it. He was very easy to get along with. Raphael, everyone loved Raphael. Bramante, who was Michelangelo's great rival, was very gregarious and outgoing and charming and friends with everybody. Everyone loved Bramante. Everyone hated Michelangelo, but he was really good at his job. So he was born in 1475, and he would boast to his assistants. He sounds actually like a really kind of snotty and horrible human being, but he boasted to his assistants that he was born when Venus and Mars were in the house of Jupiter, and that foretold the great artistic prowess or something. And he boasted about that his entire life, that the Venus and Mars in the house of Jupiter. And also he was a hypochondriac, total hypochondriac, sick all the time, complaining all the time. There are little doodles in all of his notebooks of complaining, oh, my neck hurts, my back hurts, and great hypochondriac. person after my own heart. I always feel like kinship to the hypochondriacs of the world. Where was I going with that? Yes, so he was enormously precocious. So he whether the star and the moon nonsense actually kind of bore fruit or not, but he was enormously precocious and enormously gifted, and his family was moderately well-to-do. They were kind of lesser bankers or a lesser banking family in Florence, and but by 15. Michelangelo was installed at a school, as a garden in San Marcos. It was a school created by Lorenzo de' Medici, and he excelled there and learned the art of sculpture. And by 19, he was in Bologna, making all kinds of sculptures in Bologna. He goes to Rome when he's in his early 20s in 1498, so he's not even 25 yet. He's 23, 22. He gets a commission, receives a commission from like a French cardinal, and the French cardinal wanted a depiction of the Pietà. So that's the mother, Mary, holding her son, holding the body of Christ. He wanted a depiction of the Pietà for the top of his tomb, and the commission is granted to Michelangelo. The terms of the contract, this is kind of a daunting contract. Maybe no one other than Michelangelo would take this on. But the terms were that it had to be a sculpture more beautiful than anyone had ever seen ever in Rome, ever. That sounds awful. That sounds like a lot of pressure. But to everyone's astonishment, Michelangelo delivered, and he created this work. It's really astounding. It's now installed. It's in a horrible location. I think if it was in a different museum or a different space in Rome, it would hold kind of a greater sway and maybe our collective imagination, or be as well known perhaps as the David, because it's in St. Peter's. It's in St. Peter's Basilica, and so you know how enormous. I mean, it's one of the biggest churches in the world. It's this huge space, and you feel dwarfed as you enter. And so you go in, and then there's the Pietà immediately on your right. It's behind bulletproof glass because some nut tried to attack it with a chisel however many years ago. But it's small, not small like this. It's like a life size. It's a life size depiction of Mary and Christ. But it's dwarfed. It's so dwarfed by the enormity of St. Peter's, and so we can't even kind of process it as a work, I find, and it's kind of loud and busy in there. So I'm going to start a petition. I'm going to start a petition to move the Pietà somewhere better than St. Peter's. I don't like it. I'll write to Francis and be like, listen, Francis. And when this was unveiled to the Roman public, this was really Michelangelo's entrance into the public eye, and this caused such a stir and raised such astonishment among the Roman people. And Vasari wrote. So Vasari is that sometimes dubiously accurate chronicler of the lives of the artists. I've mentioned Vasari quite often, but Vasari writes about the Pietà. It is certainly a miracle that a formless block of stone could ever have been reduced to a perfection that nature is scarcely able to create in the flesh. And so it was something that the Italian public had never really seen before. The cohesiveness of the, actually I'll go back, I'll get over this. Okay, the cohesiveness of the composition here. So you have this kind of triangular composition. And the downward gaze of Mary kind of forming this triangle with the body of Christ, and then the way that his lifeless body drapes over her lap and is echoed by the drapery of her clothing in marble, right? I mean, it's just that it is like Vasari said, that it's something formless, something cold as marble could evoke such emotion or be so incredibly lifelike. For us. And so there's great pathos, so there's great pain in this moment, or sincerity. Yeah. And that gesture, I find this gesture really, really moving here. So Michelangelo is like I said, he's a mere 22, 23, 24 years old, and he has enormous success in Rome with the unveiling of the Pietà. So he does have some legs to stand on when he approaches the wardens of the Duomo and says, you know what, you should hand over that 17-foot block of Carrara marble. Have I said that it's expensive? It's really expensive. You should hand it over to me. And they do, and this is what he creates. He works on it for 3 years in his workshop behind the Duomo. What is my next slide? Oh yes, okay. I can't remember what I had up next. What is my next big point here? Yes. So what I'd like to talk to you about is why we so often have these pieces. So these works like the Mona Lisa or like the David or like one of Jackson Pollock's paintings or something in Picasso. It's like these works of art that we're all supposed to know and that we recognize and we're supposed to feel something. It's like we have to. When you go to the MoMA, you better see Van Gogh's Starry Night, and you better feel something when you're looking at it, right? Or there's something wrong with you, right? So it's like we're meant to know how these things are artistically great intuitively, and that's just nonsense. Our brains don't work that way. So I'd like to take a few minutes here tonight to explain why this work does hold such sway kind of in our minds, and why millions of people go to see it, why they should go to see it, and then why it's in all of the art history books. And art historians often talk about this work as being one of the works that symbolizes the transition from the early Renaissance, so the Florentine Renaissance, into the High Renaissance. So the time of kind of the mid-career, middle-aged Michelangelo, so Michelangelo the Sistine Chapel, and then also later Leonardo and Raphael. So for that, keep this in mind. We will come back. We'll come back to the David, but I'd like to back up and give you a bit of context first. These are some doors. I've showed you these before, but I love them. I'll bring them up again. So these are Hildesheim, some doors from the Hildesheim Cathedral in what's now Germany. And these are these doors were constructed in the Romanesque period, so during the Middle Ages, so around 1015 AD. So this is in the middle. This is in the middle of the Middle Ages. Okay, so right smack in the middle. And then the Renaissance starts kind of late 1300s, 1400s. So we have another 300 years of the Renaissance, or the Middle Ages after this. And I'd like to draw your attention. This is a bunch of scenes from the Old Testament here, but I'd like to draw your attention to this scene in particular. Then I have another view. Here we go. So for about 1,000 years, any type of nudity of the human body or depiction of the human body was usually couched in a biblical narrative, or there was some kind of religious component, so there had to be some kind of narrative to it. So what we see here, this is the figure of God, and we can tell it's God because he has a big halo, and God is pointing at Adam. You can see he's like, what have you done? And Adam is here, and this is a scene from the expulsion of the Garden of Eden, and Adam is covering. You see him frantically covering his genitals with a leaf here. With his left arm, with his right arm, he points under his left arm over, and he points it at Eve. And then Eve is also covering herself, and she's pointing frantically down at the serpent at her feet. So God here again says, "What have you done?" And Adam says, "I don't know. She did it." And Eve says, "He made me do it." And you can see how clearly delineated this narrative is. So this is again in the Middle Ages. This is a relatively new religion. They're trying to deftly and clearly communicate the basis or the premises behind the Christian faith. There's nothing else. There's no superfluous detail here. There's no, who cares what human anatomy looks like? Who cares that women really have 2 breasts? One gets the point across, right? We know it's Eve. We know that's Adam. He has no hair. She has hair. We know that's a serpent. We know that's God. He has a great big halo. And their features are exaggerated, right? So their eyes are overly large. Often their arms and their hands are overly large. Especially you can see this with Eve, the size of the heads. So it's not that we have this idea sometimes, or conflate the idea of the Middle Ages with the Dark Ages, right? That they forgot Greek and Roman learning. But really is that the purpose of art shifts. It shifts away from naturalism or realism or real depiction of the human body. Why bother showing accurate musculature when you need to explain to the unwashed and usually illiterate masses why you shouldn't disobey God? It's bad. Bad things will happen. God will come pointy with his finger at you. Right? So it's about a simplification of the narrative. And also nudity is associated with sin. So lustfulness and sin lies within the human body. And the gaze during the Middle Ages was meant to look away from the earth and look towards heaven. So think about the divine. And so they were very careful not to include anything about the human body that could incite lust. Maybe that's why she only has 1 breast. Maybe that did it for no. Okay, so this is to compare. This is a Roman copy of a sculpture called Doris, and this was a copy after a Greek original. But look at the difference between the depiction of the human body, say with Adam. So he has very kind of spindly legs. Obviously his torso is too large, his head is too large, he has no neck. Compared to a Greek depiction, a classical depiction of the male form. So there's great accuracy to the human body. Look at the legs and the knees here, down to the tendons in the feet. There are some idealized elements, right? So you can there are it's not wholly accurate in the torso and the head, but it's a much more naturalistic approach to the human body. So you can tell that they're artistically interested in the depiction of the nude form and what the nude form could express. Just briefly also, I'd like to talk to you about the role of Donatello, because Donatello is one of the important sculptors of the early Renaissance. He's kind of the precursor to Michelangelo, and it's really difficult to understand Michelangelo's role without understanding Donatello, what came before. So this is Donatello's St. Mark, and it's in a niche in a building called the Orsa Michele, which is it was a grain storage building in the center of Florence. You can still go there on Tuesdays from like 11:15 to 1:12 or something. It's operated by volunteers. But it's really charming. Nobody goes. The statues in the niches are copies, and the originals are upstairs in the granary. They had to have grain storage inside the city in case they were under siege by the pesky Milanese, so that's why there was a grain building. So you can go see the Orsa Michele, like I said, at very, very odd hours. And I was there at the perfect time, just this last this earlier in the summer. And I was like, we're here. I've never been upstairs next to Michele. Come on, Caleb, let's go. We're going to go see St. Mark. It's going to be great. This is like one of the most pivotal statues or sculptures of the early Renaissance. So Caleb and I trek up, and I couldn't find St. Mark. I was like, where is St. Mark? And there was a plywood box in the back, and St. Mark was under restoration. So it was very sad. So we have to make sure that we're once again there on a Tuesday between 11:13 and 12:22. If you happen to go, I'm sure they'll be done the St. Mark restoration by then. But anyway, you can see the replica outside, and it's fine. So this is Donatello's depiction of St. Mark. And this work, there's something that happens in the work of Donatello, these early Renaissance sculptures, that it's a shift. It's one of those moments when we realize, or it's very apparent that we're no longer, this isn't the Gothic period, this isn't the Middle Ages anymore. Something completely changes. And what changes is Donatello's approach to the human body. So we have Donatello, or we have St. Mark, I'm sorry. He's resting most of his weight on his right leg, and his left leg is bearing less of his weight, and the knee is protruding there slightly from the drapery. His body appears proportional, so there's a sense of a definite body underneath the drapery. So he's thought about where are the internal organs fitting? What do shoulders look like? How does drapery fall around shoulders? And I've talked about this so many times before. You'll probably all be sick of this, but you'll be experts. This is a very popular pose for classical statuary, and then it re-emerges in the Renaissance when they start to have a resurgence of interest in antiquity. And it's a pose, it's called the Contrapposto, so it's the counter pose, Contrapposto. And what it means is that if you see in medieval depictions of the human body, the weight is evenly distributed on both legs. It tends to look very static. I mean, it is static. Nobody ever stands like this. Nobody stands with their weight on both legs. That's just weird. We always are shifting from one leg to the other, right? Or we're about to move. We're never ever standing there like that just doesn't happen. It's not naturalistic, it's unnatural. And so classical artists would often place the full weight of the figure's body on one leg. So what happens immediately is that the body then shifts slightly over. You can try it when you stand up. Your body shifts over to compensate, and then that hip that is supporting the weight kind of juts out to that side so we don't tip over. Then this leg is free to move. So here, Doris, his left leg then is free to move in space. And so our hip tilts, our shoulders tilt in the opposite direction, and then often our head is moving about somewhere as well. Our head is rarely facing straight forward, right? Our head is moving and our bodies are moving. So very, very elegant contrapposto here, which is picked up by Donatello here in his depiction of St. Mark. And the leg isn't moving as dramatically as it was in Doris, but you can see it's much more now. Look at that straight leg. And you all know, we all wear like bathrobes, like when drapery falls straight down, when that leg is totally straight, and then you can feel that. Like we know that's realistically how drapery flows over our body. So here his left leg is about to move forward. His hips are tilting this way, his shoulders are tilting slightly this way, his head is moving slightly in space. So St. Mark, Donatello's depiction of St. Mark has much more in common with the classical sculpture than it does with anything from the medieval era. So Donatello, his motivation here is not storytelling. It's non-narrative. He's telling the story through the depiction of the body. St. Mark has no halo, right? He doesn't need that. So by the time we reach the Renaissance, the public is more knowledgeable. He's dealing with a much more literate audience in Florence. And they would see a kinship between the figure of St. Mark and his gravitas, that he's presented as a scholar, as a philosopher. And we read his kind of religiosity or his dignity or his divinity in his pose, in the gracefulness of his pose and that seriousness of his gaze. No halo. This is Donatello's depiction of the David. So this comes along about 50 or 60 years prior to Michelangelo's depiction. No one cares about this one. I always show this. I show this to my students. I'm like, look at this. This is really, really important. And they're like, no, don't care, because they know about Michelangelo. So if you can just not think about Michelangelo, put Michelangelo out of your head for now. This is a really, really remarkable work because it's the first freestanding, I gotta slow down. It's the first freestanding male nude since antiquity. This is a really big deal. Why is someone gasping? I was with my students, I'm like, The first freestanding male nude since antiquity. So that means essentially that all we've had for a number of years is for 1,000 years, something like this. So there would be potentially a nude shown in relief, or if there was a figure that was sculpted, the figure would be closed. So first freestanding genitalia hanging out depiction of man for 1,000 years. And once again, Donatello seizes upon the idea of David. And because Donatello is a Florentine artist, and David is like I said, kind of holding that position or that idea in the Florentine consciousness, this is probably more akin to the narrative or the biblical story of David than Michelangelo's. I hear that too from my students, that Michelangelo's David looks too old. It's supposed to be a kid in the story, right? It's supposed to be a youth. And so here we have a much more youthful depiction of David. We notice that it's post slaying of Goliath, right? We know it is very apparent here that we're dealing with the story of David and Goliath, because David is very jauntily standing on the head of Goliath here. I have a better image of that. Oh, here we go. Great. So here's the head of Goliath, severed head of Goliath. And David, in this exaggerated kind of preening, I think, contrapposto or counterpose. Look at this. Look at those hips. So there's all of his weight standing on, leaning on his right leg. And then again, his left leg is free to be relatively weightless, and it's resting on the head of Goliath. He's so smug. And then his hips tilt this way. Look at that hip tilt. And then his shoulders tilt. Using a better angle here. So hips go this way, shoulders go this way, and then the head can move on an axis. So it's a much more, we talk about sculptures working in the round also, right? So this is a sculpture you can walk around, and that it's more naturalistic, so it's moving. It can almost like spiraling in space. I put this here. So this is the depiction. Donatello's sculpture is in the Bargello Museum in Florence. I talked about this. No one ever goes to the Bargello. Go to the Bargello. It's awesome. I've harped on at length about these two competition panels by Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. So it's in the same room. We were there. This is June. No one's in there. Why is no one in there? Do they not know how important this is, or this? Oh. Anyway, you go to the Bargello. It's great. Yes. So you can walk around Donatello's David. It's a little smaller than life size. It's made out of bronze. Bronze is really hard to work with, so it's a little smaller. So here, David, he has little boots on, and he's clasping the sword of Goliath, which he's used presumably to chop off his head. He's wearing a little hat that was very kind of a Florentine fashion, Renaissance fashion, this little hat. He's carrying the rock with which he used to slay the giant. He slayed Goliath with the rock. So there are lots of visual clues here that we're dealing with the depiction of David. It's quite, again, like this, nothing like this. This is such a radical departure from anything we would have seen. Can you imagine something like this on the doors of Hildesheim? Like, it's just like nothing. This couldn't have been conceived of in the Middle Ages. It's much more closely linked with a Greek or Roman approach, especially in its very kind of erotic or homoerotic. I mean, look at the feathers of the helmet reaching up under, like right in between the legs here. His stance. The idea, like sexuality but then also biblical story are put together here. So the nudity and like I said, kind of the overt, some instances of overt eroticism can coalesce or can form a cohesive package with this biblical narrative. And that's I think part of the Renaissance idea, that they don't see any problem in studying and learning or believing, having faith in the Greek and Roman idea, but then also being Christian and using the ideas of Plato or Aristotle or the artists from the Greek and Roman era and combining them with a religiosity or with Christian religiosity. So now we'll turn to Michelangelo's depiction of David. So this is a number of decades later, so 4 or 5, 6 decades after Donatello's depiction. And this is, again, we've shifted from the early Renaissance to what is the beginning of the High Renaissance. So early Renaissance in the 1400s, High Renaissance, so think like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and Raphael in the 1500s. So probably first noticeably that Michelangelo's David is a little bit older, a little more muscular, right? He's not so prepubescent. There's nothing jaunty about Michelangelo's David, much more serious. There's a solemnness or seriousness to his expression, so he's gazing off into the distance. He's carrying in his right arm kind of presumably we can read it as a sling, but it's some kind of a piece of fabric that he has over his shoulder. We once again see, look at that Contrapposto. All the weight is on his left or his right leg. His left leg is free to move and turn, as is his torso. There's the tilt, and then the head moving. Michelangelo is known, especially later in his life when he goes to tackle the tomb, Pope Julius's tomb, and then the Sistine Chapel ceiling. You know, he's known like very muscular. Like he does these big muscular men and women. All his women are big and muscular as well. And you can see that the genesis of that here with the depiction of the David. So very muscularly defined torso here in the shoulders, and you can see that he's actually looking at real human bodies, which is something that was not relevant to the artists in the Renaissance or in the Middle Ages, but it's something that obviously classical artists or Greek and Roman artists did and were interested in, and then likewise Michelangelo was interested in the deep anatomy of the human body. Oh, and notice, that's why I had that close up there, the tendons in the hand, and then the hand here, and the veins, and you see that from people who go to the gym, I guess, right? They have you can actually see the veins in their arms, right? And then these indentations here in the chest, and then the tendons or the kind of the bones in the neck also. So incredibly lifelike. Look at that. Where'd it go? There we go. Yeah. And it's so large, like I said, it's 17 feet. You can actually get up quite close and really see the bone structure and the veins in the hand. So there are these moments of delicacy with this kind of massive depiction of muscularity as well. You can walk around. It's the Sala di Accademia, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. But you can walk around the David also, and get a sense that he's not moving, right? Like he's contained within the space. And if you come to my next lecture on Bernini's David, we'll talk about how he's not contained in the space, and that's part of the Baroque idea. But the Renaissance idea is this idea of like the difference between potential and kinetic energy. Oh boy, the bit of science for the night. my physics teacher giving me the thumbs up here. So this is a potential energy versus kinetic energy of the Baroque period. So potential energy in the Renaissance. So the Renaissance figures and work typically stays contained within a niche or contained within its space. But there's great potential for power, or that there's a sense that there is something pent up here, that this figure of David is capable of great energy or great expenditure of power here. But he is like I said, contained within the space. What's also interesting, if we compare Donatello's version here, so there the obvious differences in the muscularity of the figure and kind of the seriousness and the solemnity and this idea of terribleness. They like the idea of terribilita, so that there's potential for rage is kind of, kind of great power is talked about in Michelangelo's work a lot. But notice the references to the story. So the narrative references are completely stripped, almost completely stripped, from Michelangelo's version. So there's no head of Goliath. It's presumably before Goliath has been killed, so he switched the timing of the narrative of the story. There's no sword, there's no stone. This is, maybe it's a sling. It doesn't, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't really, we read it as a sling because we know that it's David. But again, if I stripped away all of your knowledge of this figure in culture, and I told you, look at this great sculpture of Apollo or Zeus, right? You'd be like, yes, that's an excellent sculpture of Apollo, right? It looks more like a Greek god. We could read it as a figure of Greek mythology, rather than something from the Judeo-Christian narrative. So we're moving even farther away from, the need to overlay it with Christian symbols. Some lunatic attacked it again with a hammer. I don't know why they were attacking things with hammers. And in 1991, hacked off a chunk of the toes. So his toes are in bad shape. Yep. Yeah. So what happened is that Michelangelo worked on this sculpture from 1501 to 1504 in behind the Duomo. And he finished. It looks great. Everybody loves it. Isn't this wonderful? They want to put it up on the buttresses in the Duomo, but it weighs 6 tons. How are we getting it up there? I don't know why. They're all geniuses. Why did nobody think maybe we can't put a marble sculpture on top of the Duomo? So there's that, but then also they thought it was really, really good, so maybe we shouldn't put it way up high where no one can see it. Oh, and that's why my students always point this out too. His hands are really big. The hands and the head are quite large. And so it's meant to be viewed like it's 50 feet, 60 feet up in the air. So that's why kind of there's this enlargement slightly. And also the genitalia is small. That's a Renaissance theme. So small genitalia in the Renaissance. I think because also the idea of kind of youthfulness or kind of prepubescence, right? It doesn't quite mesh. Like obviously he's older than a prepubescent, but it's just a thing in the Renaissance. Small genitalia. My students always ask that too. Why? So they have a problem. They know they need to put it somewhere. Where are they going to put it? And they decide there's a few options. There's a committee that's struck. There's 30 kind of leaders of Florence, comprised of kind of thinkers and politicians, but then also artists. Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci and Perugino served on this committee. Where to put Michelangelo's David? And so they have a few ideas, and most of them revolve around this piazza here. So this is the Piazza della Signoria. It's kind of the big, it's like the town square, essentially, in Florence. And then this is the city hall, the Palazzo della Signoria, or the Palazzo Vecchio, as it's called now. Here it is. This is the Palazzo Vecchio. They think about putting it under these arches. Maybe it could go in there. But then there's another group that says, nope, it should be right out front of the Palazzo della Signoria, so outside of the city hall, because that'll stand for who we are. The problem is Donatello had a sculpture there. Donatello had this sculpture already at the entrance to the Palazzo della Signoria. This is his depiction of Judith and Holofernes. But good thing Donatello was dead, so they moved it inside. He couldn't complain. So they stick Judith and Holofernes inside the Palazzo della Signoria, and they install Michelangelo's David at the entrance to their city hall. And supposedly his eyes, his gaze, he's looking towards Rome, who was causing trouble for Florence at the time. So his gaze is looking to, stay away, Rome, we have our eye on you, kind of thing. Supposedly. So there is a replica this is the replica that we're looking at here now. It was moved in 1873. They were starting to see some degradation to the sculpture, and they wanted to move it to a safer space. This is from kind of the late 1800s, the scene of the Piazza della Signoria. And there's a period of time where there wasn't anything here. They put the replica there in the 1910s. So there was a chunk of time where you couldn't see the David in this particular piazza. This is the Uffizi down here. All kinds of stuff. Oh boy, all kinds of stuff to see in Rome. So in the late 1800s, it was moved to the Arts Academy of Florence. So it's called the Accademia. They built this special niche for it here. And that's where we see it today. So this is a contemporary photograph. It's like worshiping at a temple. You come in, you have to book on. There's a lineup always, and you come in and it's very hushed, and you kind of walk down this corridor, and there are statues or sculptures by Michelangelo, unfinished sculptures, and they're sculptures that were supposed to adorn the tomb of Julius II. And they're like I said, they're unfinished. There's still kind of chunks of their bodies that are still encased in the stone, and it looks like they're trying to escape. It's really eerie, like it's whoa. So we walk down this corridor, and then the David is perfectly lit, and it's in this like archway, literally under a halo. Anyway, there's all kinds of theory, contemporary museum theory about how museums have replaced temples in our minds, right? We go, and like we don't do pilgrimages so much anymore, but we make a pilgrimage to go see and kind of essentially worship the David, right? Anyway, that's too much museum theory for tonight. Moving on. This is the David in the Accademia in the 1850s. This is just a funny little story, which I'll end on here tonight. There was a bit of a row between London, between the National Gallery in England and the Tuscan Duke, so Leopold II, because the National Gallery in London wanted to buy something to add to their permanent collection. And Leopold vetoed it. I don't know what it was. I couldn't find out what it was. But he was like, nope, you can't have it. But what you can have instead is a cast of of the David. We'll make a cast. No cast had ever been made. It's really, really difficult. Like you have to, you would pour plaster on and then be really, really careful and take it off. And you have to put all of that, the mold together and then pour the more plaster down into it. And it's a really complicated thing. And this is there were 2 copies made, but the only actual cast made. And so Leopold, apparently Victoria was a little miffed about his vetoing of this purchase. So Leopold says, I'll send you a cast of the David. You'll have a perfect replica of the David for your own collection. And so it was a little unwieldy. They didn't really know where to put it, so they stuck it in the South Kensington Museum. And here it is. It was shipped over in 3 pieces. And here it is in the South Kensington Museum. Looking really large, right? And then it was moved. It was moved to the Victoria and Albert Museum shortly after a short stay at the South Kensington Museum. And the story is that when Queen Victoria came to see the David for herself, see the replica of the David, she was shocked and appalled at that minuscule genitalia. Didn't like it one little bit. So the Victoria and Albert Museum, they had to create a special fig leaf for the David, for their copy. And so that's still in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They had to make 2 little special hooks, and they would hook the leaf on whenever Victoria was coming to visit. Oh, that's great. I think it's just like the Italians and the British, just like. Oh. Oh, and just one other note before we end. There's a big celebration, some kind of anniversary in 2010 in Florence, and they made a fiberglass model, like a to-scale model of the David, and they put it on one of the buttresses to give the world a sense of where it was intended or what it was supposed to look like. And it was only there for 1 day. Yeah, but then that's what Michelangelo had envisioned. Yeah. So the head, you can imagine for those like down on the street level, the head and the hands would have looked to scale. And I've used this photo before, but I just wanted to talk about too, again, just how sometimes it's hard to distance ourselves from these works. Like we look at the Mona Lisa or the David, and it's hard to, because it's just part of our popular culture now, obviously, and there's so much kitsch associated with the David. You can buy little pink Davids, little neon pink Davids everywhere in Florence. I think they're great. But just there is a reason generally why they are a part of the collective consciousnus or part of our cultural narrative. But yeah, he's everywhere, David. And so up next this isn't nearly as popular, but it's great. I promise it's great. So we're comparing Michelangelo's David we're shifting now into the next period for the next couple lectures with Bernini. And you may not know Bernini's name as well as Michelangelo, but he's really the inheritor, the Baroque inheritor to Michelangelo, and just an amazing, amazing sculptor. I think he might even be better than Michelangelo. I know. That was a reaction. That was good. So we'll be talking about the Baroque idea and what the Baroque period means, and Rome a little bit more. And then in between, this isn't art history, but I thought I'd stick it in and tell you. That's me and Caleb, obviously. We're talking about how to build an art collection. So it's just like, how do you start going about collecting art, and how do you research about artists, and even if you're working on any kind of budget, how do you start to go about that? And then later in October, I'm doing, basically it's just more Bernini. It's an excuse to talk about Bernini. So if you've been to Rome, you've been completely surrounded by Bernini's work. And then the final thing I'll end on is something very exciting that Caleb and I are cooking up for maybe a year and 2 or 3 months from now, because people have asked us about this, and we're like, oh, I don't know, maybe we'll try to make it work. We are thinking about taking a group, potentially, to Florence. So we're working on it. We have. I know a lot of you have kind of talked to me about that, or talked to Caleb. If I already have your email, if you've left that with me, great. But if any of you are interested in when we finally get the details hammered out, like just email me. But I promise it's in the works. I want to let you know that we're diligently working on that, and we'll announce it really soon. As soon as we get it all figured out, we'll post it. Yeah.
I want to ask you. So the statue of David is sitting outside now. That people see.
Yeah. Where
did that come from?
Yes, that was a second.
Composition of that statue.
Yeah, that was a second replica. So Leopold he did 2 replicas. He commissioned two casts. And so one he sent to London, and one they put in the Piazza della Signoria. Yeah. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. Great. And that's it. So thank you very much for coming. Hopefully see you in a couple weeks.